this episode of Restoring the Sciences. This is a webinar that is hosted by the National Association of Scholars. I'm Scott Turner, the host for this webinar series, also of the National Association of Scholars. Our guest tonight is Bradley Watson, who is Associate Professor of Government at the Washington, D.C. campus of Hillsdale College. He joined Hillsdale in 2022, and prior to that, he held a rather distinguished chair, the Philip and McKenna Chair in American and Western Political Thought at Saint Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. And he resigned in 2022 after a rather heated controversy, and that's going to be we're going to be covering that during our webinar today. Just a couple things about our guest tonight. He published in the American Spectator not too long ago a very provocative article called Institutional Capture. It Can Happen Here, and that's going to be the principal topic of our presentation tonight. Just to give a little plug, this is looking backwards, no doubt, but he's also the author of a very interesting book, which I'm reading right now, Progressivism, The Strange History of a Radical Idea by University of Notre Dame Press. And I've put links to his profile page at Hillsdale, and also a link to the article that's going to be the main topic of our discussion tonight. So, Brad, welcome to Restoring the Sciences. I'm very glad to have you here, and I'm looking forward to what's bound to be a fun conversation. Okay, so you wrote about this in the American Spectator article, but could you just take us through the circumstances that led to you deciding that Saint Vincent College just wasn't for you anymore?
Sure. I've written in that Spectator piece and elsewhere. I've mentioned how much has been written about sort of intellectual failings of America's institutions of higher learning, including their ignorance or outright suppression of the achievements of Western civilization to which the modern university owes its existence. But far less, I think, has been said about their moral failings, and in particular, the absence of the moral virtue of courage that really enables the pursuit of every radical fad. And at a certain point in 2022, after this controversy over the speaker blew up, I realized or I came to the conclusion that, there's a point at which an institution can't be saved from itself. If I was in a position, as I was, of fighting these battles for academic freedom, intellectual freedom more broadly, essentially alone, I could probably and should probably devote my limited energies to a place that better appreciates them. I had sort of gave up basically when it became clear, after a long series of early warning indicators and then the conference blow up, and I had arguments with the administration over things for most of the period of sort of the COVID lockdowns, over questions of academic freedom, though not specifically related to COVID. There became an increasing shall we say, race consciousness among the senior administrators, and it was certainly becoming clear that certain kinds of topics might become off limits, or teaching certain kinds of books, frankly, might become off limits. And this was before the conference blow up. And when I had this, organized this conference in April of 2022, one of the first major events we'd been allowed to organize on campus after the, sort of COVID lockdown, I did it on a topic that I thought was particularly timely and important. It was called Politics, Policy, and Panic, Governing in Times of Crisis. I had speakers dealing with, the sort of moral panic associated with everything from healthcare mandates to violence in the streets and, calls for racial justice. So sort of what the heck has been going on in America for the past a couple of years, as America seemed, to the eyes of some, and I would put myself in this category, to be moving toward at least elite institutions, a kind of increasingly authoritarian stance on various things. And one of the speakers gave a very spirited talk denouncing affirmative action, calling for the equal treatment of of all Americans. He had the audacity to title the talk Black Privilege, Racial Hysteria in Contemporary America, an obvious play on the ubiquitousness of the phrase white privilege. But it was really a talk, in a way, it was an old-fashioned anti-affirmative action talk. But this caused the administration's heads to explode. They accused him in a public letter of, the usual academic buzz phrases, promoting invidious discrimination and systemic bigotry and so forth, for essentially criticizing special preferences, sort of formal and informal preferences, cultural preferences and so forth. And they announced the takeover of this academic center that I had directed for many, many years, the Center for Political and Economic Thought, which had been dedicated to the study of freedom, Western civilization, and the American experience. It's one of the oldest collegiate centers of its kind in the nation. They announced that henceforth, every outside speaker who would appear on campus would have to be personally approved by the president or his designees, and it was very clear what kinds of topics would be off limits. Things having to do with certain cultural controversies, certainly affirmative action and racial controversies would be off limits. And it became very clear to me early on that I was not going to have a single public voice amongst, certainly from the administration, but not even from among the faculty, grown, tenured individuals who, would have to demonstrate only minimal levels, really, of courage to say something in support of academic freedom. Many of them expressed private outrage, but they wouldn't say anything publicly. And that is kind of when I realized that I would be destined to fight these battles completely alone, and even people who were, in some sense, my friends on these things were not willing to say anything publicly. I realized that it was probably time to move. I'd been there for 23 years. I'd helped build this center to national prominence. I built a small but very influential Great Books politics department. I'd had some real opportunities there, and the institution historically had been very sensible. It had not been a kind of crazy woke place. Administrations and the faculty certainly leaned left, but they had allowed Saint Vincent, as the oldest Benedictine college in the country, to remain, as I said in the introductions to many books I published when I was there, remarkably open to the conversation about ideas that has animated so much of Western civilization. So they really allowed us to run this center, which was dedicated to presenting heterodox political, cultural, economic arguments to exist unimpeded. But that all changed with when a new president came in just before COVID. And as I said, there were a number of early warning indicators. It culminated in this conference of April of 2022, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which is a sort of watchdog organization it's now the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, so they've broadened their mandate to education, but a watchdog organization for sort of free speech, intellectual freedom, First Amendment issues, described the actions of the Saint Vincent administration as the most extreme example of the guest speaker censorship they'd ever seen in 20 years of existence. And coming from FIRE, that's really quite something. So this policy still exists now. All speakers must be, approved by the president or his designees. And there is a kind of, I would say, compared to when I was there, an atmosphere of, in my view, and I know in the view of many of my former colleagues, a kind of authoritarian atmosphere. And it's very sad to see an institution like St. Vincent, which had been one of the very few places where, heterodox arguments were routinely presented in a sea of academic orthodoxy, to see that crumble very quickly. But it really only takes one administrative change, one change of the president for that to happen. So I became a little bit, more than a little bit, disenchanted. I mean, some of the major donors of the center, several of them walked away quite justifiably when they realized what was going on. And it seemed like I would not be able to continue to go on and build things and make serious arguments. And for that matter, we had a memo before the conference from a senior administrator suggesting that even it would be dangerous to teach even certain books in the classroom if those books contained what he called a particular racial epithet. And as I said at the time, this would rule out the teaching of Mark Twain, Flannery O'Connor, James Baldwin. And since I teach entirely through primary sources, great books of Western civilization, great political writings of the American tradition, I could not agree to such an infringement on academic freedom. So there were other things too, but after this conference and the takeover, and I think functionally the destruction of our longstanding center, I thought there was no hope of reform at the institution, at least in the course of my career, so it was best to move on.
Okay, so that pretty much covers the whole depressing story. Before we get into our conversation here, let me just ask our audience. You're welcome to submit questions at any time during our conversation. We'll come to questions and answers about 45 minutes in. I would like to ask you to please put them in the Q&A rather than the chat, but no matter where they end up, we'll try to get to them. So you mentioned the new president that came in, Reverend Paul Taylor, I believe his name is, and I was browsing around through various articles about this, and I came across the letter that he wrote to the community after the controversy arose, which again, looking at some of the reports, it didn't seem like there was that much controversy among the students there. There was certainly a small group of rabble-rousers that objected very strongly to the talk of this of the speaker, who, by the way, is our friend David Azerrad, also at Hillsdale College. But I came across the statement from the president, and I was really struck by the statement, and I'm just going to quote it here. He says, "Our community will not allow the platform of our college to be used to promote a message contrary to our mission." And if that doesn't encapsulate the hostility to the very purpose of a college and a university, I don't know what does. I mean, first of all, when he says our community, he's using that as a stand-in for "I will not permit." Again, that's the overreach of administration, and I think this illustrates what I think is kind of a fundamental principle of academic freedom. It's certainly the ability to express and debate questions and controversies and explore it is a part of it. But when the AAUP was being formed in 1916, and you look at some of the manifestos behind that, one of the big concepts that they thought would have to be overcome to truly guarantee academic freedom for scholars is something that they call the hired man concept, that a professor or a faculty member is a employee of the university and can be dismissed at any time for any reason whatsoever, and that the university was basically the president, the administration, and the trustees. And this certainly is a blatant example of that. And this raises the basic question, this kind of thing is happening more and more through universities, and it does raise a question: does academic freedom even exist anymore? Yeah. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, of course, at a public institution would be bound by First Amendment standards as articulated through courts of law, a long line of jurisprudence, very broad protections for freedom of expression, at least in theory, although in practice, even public institutions don't always provide the kind of secure environment where that can happen, but at least in theory, they are bound by that. Whereas private institutions, they start using language like mission. I mean, this had never been an issue, as I said, in the 23 years I had been there until this new president. That's a way of getting around, I think, their formal commitments, right? Their binding commitments to their accreditors. And in terms of the way they publicly advertise themselves, it's a way of getting around their commitments to academic and intellectual freedom. When a president at a private college hears something he doesn't like, he can fall back on this idea of mission, as if a talk criticizing certain public policies in the United States and the way in which the disorders of the last 2 years have been kind of supported by various public figures, encouraged by various public figures, which was the nature of the talk in question, as if that is in itself obviously violative of the mission of a Catholic institution. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, the president, in my view, makes a hash of church teachings there, and it's just the way of him imposing his will on the institution. But private institutions have relatively more freedom to do that than public institutions, because they can always fall back on claiming their mission. But of course, the mission of a Catholic, I mean, by definition, a universal, the universal faith, a Catholic institution, should be very open indeed to conversations about ideas, including controversial ones. So I think the president there was being very disingenuous, frankly.
Yeah, the extent of the capture of universities by this ideology, and actually by this kind of arrogant attitude of a kind of executive or professional class of university administrators and university presidents, is truly astonishing. And I can tell you, from my own experience that that public institutions really aren't, they may be presumptively bound by constitutional guarantees, but in the case of State University of New York, for example, academic freedom is right there in the basic policies of the Board of Trustees, but it actually doesn't provide much protection for faculty, and so this is universal. Speaking of Catholic, this is a phenomenon that's spreading through our entire higher education sector, and the important question, I think, is, what is it that's allowing the just rapid, thorough capture of institutions that's by groups that are completely antithetical, almost completely antithetical to the founding principles of what a university is supposed to be? And that remains an unexplained phenomenon, I think. I'm not quite sure how it happened. I think government support has a lot to do with it. But, you mentioned the other really troubling aspect is that is the almost cowardice of
Yes.
your colleagues, our colleagues, who should be expected to, stand up for these kinds of things. And I think a lot of us have had the experience where you take a principled stand and you look behind you and there's no one there anymore.
Yes.
Is it really true? Do you think, as Heather McDonald has rather pointedly put it, that faculty are basically cowards? They are not prepared to stand up for the basic principles of what they should be for. And
yeah,
you did mention that courage was in rather short supply.
Yes,
in your experience.
I mentioned this in a couple of American Spectator pieces, the one you've linked to, and then a shorter one that came out earlier in the fall. But I really do think that, at least as it manifests itself to me, and has manifested itself to me over a number of years now, as I alluded at the beginning of our talk, sure, there are intellectual failings in America's institutions. Those have been well noted, but the lack of the moral virtue of courage is really quite striking, and it's a bit hard to account for in this sense. I mean, tenure exists. One of the main purposes of tenure is to allow those who possess it the freedom, the ability to resist encroachments on, when academic freedom or intellectual freedom more broadly are really threatened. And they can do this with minimal risk. I mean, an administration can always make your life difficult. It can withdraw administrative perks and privileges, but it's a pretty heavy lift to get rid of a tenured faculty member. This means that only minimal amounts of the virtue of courage are necessary. Academics have protections that are almost unheard of in the private sector, And yet still, it's hard to spot even trace amounts of that critical virtue. And this, I think, accounts more than any other single factor for the free fall of our institutions that we see all around us, not just academic institutions, corporate institutions, media institutions, religious institutions. The unwillingness of people, at least in some critical mass, to get together and push back, resist, just say no to some of these things. And I concluded my Spectator piece by saying I can't be sure that if a critical mass of faculty members had gotten together to push back against these encroachments and the early warning signs of them, I can't be sure we would have been successful, but it was at least worth a try. It was worth a try. And this is what you find, especially in academic institutions. I think people who are unwilling to try, as I put it somewhere, people don't typically become academics due to a surfeit of courage. And this has consequences down the road, right? So I really do think we're in a moral crisis in higher education as much as we are in an intellectual crisis. And that's really the thing that my writings on this affair have emphasized, the moral, the moral freefall that we're in.
What do you, excuse me, what do you think are the roots of the roots of this fall of moral courage?
Yeah, it's a good question. Of course, I think the moral virtue of courage probably has never been in overabundance at any point in human history. But the thing that really strikes me now, especially as I say in academic institutions, is the relatively small amounts of it that are actually required, but yet you still don't see it. So I'm inclined to think it's in shorter supply in the modern age when, for the most part, none of us is at risk of, let's say, life or limb. We are at risk of the withdrawal of certain employment opportunities or perks and privileges associated with employment. And those are not nothing. I mean, I'm not downplaying them. Those are real things that people should fear. On the other hand, one might expect in this relatively genteel age compared to ages past where courage has been in short supply, that you would therefore at least see people willing to make a stand. So there is something about our modern or postmodern age, I think, which makes the virtue in even shorter supply probably than it has been historically. And maybe that's just because in a way, life has been, at least in the Western, what we can still call the Western world, pretty easy and pretty comfortable for a lot of people for several generations now, with relatively few exceptions compared to any other time in human history. And the virtue has not been called on. People have not been expected to manifest it, right? I mean, a lot has been written about the crisis of crises of child rearing and emphasizing the, if you will, the manly virtues and so forth, and the poor job we do on this. This is all somehow linked to this, but it's very hard, I think, to come up with a single reason, except to observe the fact that it does seem to be in remarkably short supply in our institutions where we need it most, our leading cultural, intellectual, public institutions.
Yeah, the fact that you contrast our relatively privileged life now compared to, say, someone who could be burned at the stake for having a heretical view. I think that's certainly a big part of it, and this is one of the kind of cynical ways that tenure doesn't really provide much of a protection, because it's like the old phrase, for the encouragement of others, and you can get rid of a tenured faculty member, but of course it's a long, drawn out, expensive, very unpleasant, often very damaging process for the for the person who is under siege. And really, all it takes is one example like that to convince others that maybe it's not really worth it to do this. And I'm not sure how to fight back about that.
Yeah, I observed in the context of this affair that you can discern a pattern if you look at a lot of these kinds of instances, as I have over the course of my academic career and my various responsibilities with organizations, including NAS. You can see, I think, a discernible pattern. That is to say, faculty members divide into roughly three groups. You have those on the academic left who welcome the wielding of administrative power because they think it will serve their political ends. And then there are those, and we were talking about this, I think, just before we started, there are those in technical disciplines, often in scientific disciplines or business disciplines, who simply don't care enough to rouse themselves from their slumbers because they believe, and I think quite mistakenly, but they believe that questions of intellectual freedom don't concern them in their little silos, their STEM silos, or wherever they are. And then the third group are those who genuinely worry about administrative despotism, and they'll offer support to people who are under attack privately, and they'll express the fact that they've been appalled by the action of the administration, but they won't find the courage to speak publicly. And this is the group that I think is most, at least for me, their actions are most perplexing. As I put it, each new crisis shows that tenure itself too often creates a sinecure without responsibility, or an aristocracy, as I put it, devoid of noblesse oblige. It might create a certain kind of intellectual and physical laziness. I don't have to do anything, so I won't. So it doesn't necessarily have the effects that it is designed to have, to encourage people to vigorously defend their prerogatives. It might, in fact, have a kind of opposite effect.
Do you think tenure has failed as an institution?
Yes, pretty much. I mean, it's a hard question to answer because one can always point, I think, to a handful of individuals who, in the absence of genuinely, sort of academically, intellectually worthy individuals who, in the absence of tenure, would be easily dismissed. On the other hand, it does create all kinds of perverse incentives and lack of incentives. On the whole, I would say the institution is not a raving success, although in a handful of instances, I think you can say it does have salutary effects. So it's not an easy question to give a simple yes or no answer to, but I certainly think we should, as a society and as academics and scholars, be thinking about alternative regimes to our, sort of process of tenure, which gives this sinecure without any sense of real obligation going along with it.
Yeah. Part of the reason for the takeover, I think, though, is that this has captured institutions at every level. Not just universities and corporations, but also the institutions that are responsible for protecting academic freedom, for ensuring intellectual quality. And so, for example, accreditation boards, for example, have been captured by this ideology, and so accreditation boards can hold the sword over the head of faculties who may not, think that it's such a good idea to kowtow to this ideology, and so that cuts off everyone's. And even the American Association for University Professors, which has been was for a long time a fairly stalwart defender of academic freedom, they even seem to have been captured by this woke virus, and so. If you compare different kinds of cases, for example, they respond very differently to, say, the infringement of academic freedom of Brett Weinstein and Heather Hying at Evergreen's State College versus assaults on academic freedom among individuals who have a politics that align more closely with the agenda of the AAUP, and I look out on the landscape and I think it's very, very bleak. It's a very bleak prospect, and I just don't know how to start chipping away at this edifice that has grown up around us.
It's everywhere. It's a blob. It's in this sort of wokeness and demand for conformity. It's insinuated itself into all our major institutions. The accrediting bodies that you mentioned that formally give their stamp of approval to colleges so that they can go on existing, essentially, have in fact, I think, themselves been captured. As far as I can tell, they won't lift a finger to defend real academic freedom concerns, or at least not normally. They're much more obsessed right now with very mind-numbingly technical matters like, institutional assessment, which, as anyone who's been in academia for a while knows, is an enormous time sink, a gigantic waste of time for faculty and administrations, puts enormous burdens on universities without any discernible positive outcomes. I often ask the question, who is assessing assessment? It is just a series of sort of bureaucratic mandates, but they don't do much, as far as I can tell, to defend, what many of us consider the core identities or purposes of institutions of higher learning, which is really to push ideas around a little bit. And the accreditation bodies are pretty, I think, useless when it comes to that. They're good at creating busy work. They're not good at really defending academic prerogatives.
So who's left to defend that in a forceful way?
Yeah, this is a good question, and I'll come back to what I've said. It's somehow there has to be some, at least if we're talking about the educational sphere, I think there has to be some combination of, secure tenured faculty, and I know they're out there. I know they often remain silent, as I've said, but we need to mobilize them. But they also need the support of a kind of newly awakened public, I think. I mean, ultimately, this has to become a public question of the highest order. And in this regard, this is where state-run institutions have some potential advantage. If you get a governor who is serious about this and starts putting real political pressure, budgetary pressure, and appointing good boards of trustees to state institutions, you can bring some salutary political pressure to bear on public institutions in a way that I think it's much more difficult to do in the case of private institutions, especially very wealthy private institutions. Those institutions might be completely lost, but public institutions, private institutions that can still respond to financial incentives and have some political pressure brought to them. So we need a kind of pincer movement, people inside the institution, but then political pressure brought to bear from the outside. But that's easy to say. It's much more difficult to do. I think Florida, Ron DeSantis is having he's showing he's serious about this question, at least. As far as I can tell, is making some real strides to get some public colleges to become more intellectually serious places. So I don't think it's impossible, but it's certainly a very heavy lift. But that's another way of saying we need, to wake up the public, and we need to give faculty members a spine. These things are very tall orders. So
yeah. I wonder if we could come back to David Azarad's talk and the sort of dynamics that led up to the conflict with Paul Taylor. So you were there, and I've read I've been following various news articles about this, and I understand that there were some people in the audience who were vocally upset by the message that David Azarad was discussing, but that many other students did what they're supposed to do, which is we expect them to do. They were listening respectfully. I don't know the nature of the Q&A sessions, but I understand it was okay. So can you tell us what was going on during that talk?
Yeah, sure. It was a long Q&A session. The speaker stayed around for a long time to really engage every single student who had questions afterwards. I would say, as was typical of Saint Vincent College, the vast majority of students, as you described them, they were listening intently. They were asking real but respectful questions, and the Q&A was quite robust, and it went on, as I say, for a very long time. The speaker was extremely generous with his time, stayed along for at least an hour or more after the talk to address questions. There was a small number of students who came because they were, the title they found too provocative, and many people in the audience thought they didn't come really to listen to the talk so much as just express their opposition. This seemed to have some institutional support from some, sort of student affairs types, bureaucrats, and so forth, to it's hard to know exactly what, but certainly the authorities, as it were aware before the talk happened that students were agitated about this, and it's unclear the extent to which they might have even encouraged that. But it was a very small number of students, and the another person in the audience, though, who was there in retrospect to do us harm, was actually a board member of the college. She was a very partisan board member, a failed Democratic congressional candidate in Pennsylvania named Bibiana Birio. She was there for every session, and at the end of the conference, she described the talk in question as, I think her phrase was, rage-inducing extreme speech. Many people, when they read that, thought she was licensing rage as a response to speech, and obviously, reporting back to the president on how unacceptable all of this was. At the end of the conference, I quickly had a number of phone calls from angry alums or people who claimed to be alums of the college. Not a large number, a small number, but they were very vehement, rude, occasionally threatening. One of these alums posted something on a social media platform, which I was informed of by another student who had seen it, who concluded with an exhortation to, quote, "Let's blow this man up," referring to me. I raised this with the administration, the same administration that had been very quick before the videos had even been publicly released, very quick to denounce in strong terms an invited speaker. If they would denounce, this obviously, I think, hate-filled rhetoric on the part of an alum of the college directed against a current faculty member, I heard nothing but the sound of chirping critics from the administration and from my faculty colleagues. And as I said, I might have said it in the Spectator piece, if it weren't for double standards, academia would have no standards at all. So, the talk, and a number of students came up to me afterwards and said how impressed they were, because here is a person presenting a controversial topic very forthrightly in a manner they're just not used to hearing on college campuses, and how impressed they were with the talk. There was a very small number of students who went there to be upset. And, there was a particular board member, a trustee of the college, who was there, I think, to, it was certainly my impression and the impression of others that she was there specifically to report on us and do us harm with the administration, which of course is what happened, at least. And it's probably worth noting too that the chairman of the Saint Vincent Board of Directors is none other than Art Rooney, who's also the head of the Pittsburgh Steelers organization, and therefore the keeper of the so-called Rooney Rule of affirmative action in the NFL. And more than a few people wondered whether or not there was a pressure from the board on the president to do something about this, or the president was, sort of going along with the flow. It's not quite clear. It's very difficult to tease out these things, but certainly there was either board ignorance of what was going on, or there was an active effort to crush a major academic unit of the college from board members. But either way, I mean, the board was complicit. They either know what's going on or they don't. Either way, the board ultimately is accountable for these things. So the focus on getting the right people on college boards, which can be done, I think, sometimes relatively more easily in public institutions than it can in private institutions, is a very important thing. And we can't forget the importance of getting people who understand higher education, what it's for, what its purposes are, and are willing to fight for that. I know that there were some murmurings on the Saint Vincent College board about the president's action in this case, but not sustained murmurings in a way that suggested any board members, again, were really willing to fight, to invest, political capital in resisting what he was doing.
Yeah, we come back to the statement from Paul Taylor about our community, and from looking at some of the news articles that I've been digging up here, it looks like it was a fairly small group of people, probably the same group of people who were disruptive at David Azarad's talk, who approached Paul Taylor or the trustees. Obviously, they found a receptive audience there, but the extent to which that's the community is probably doubtful. And this is an example, I think, of a very subtle version of the heckler's veto, and I also looked at some of the news reports about this from local television stations interviewing students, and one of the attitudes that struck me was that the impression among the students seemed to be of Saint Vincent College as a kind of a cradle where they needed to be protected, and one student said, I just can't believe that such ideas could be promulgated in an institution that I love. Okay, and there's the whole alma mater thing and like that. But it seems like this culture, this therapeutic culture, is a big part of it, and also the notion that administrators seem to be overall terrified of getting students angry with them.
Yes.
And again, that's
lack of backbone, lack of courage on the part of the administration.
Exactly, and yeah.
Your question is a very good one. What is the community? I used to think I was a member of that community. All the people associated with our Center for Political and Economic Thought were members of that community. All the generations of students whom we had benefited. And you mentioned that some students exhibited that sort of therapeutic, attitude, if you will. I don't think that was the majority of certainly not the majority of the students who went to that talk. That exists on all campuses. Now, they might have had a disproportionate voice in terms of the people the local media chose to interview. I noted that none of the local media chose to interview me or ask me about it. I don't know if the administration directed them away from me. I don't know. Our PR office was involved in it. I assume no one was encouraged to speak to me, but also local media people are, a combination of incompetent and lazy. It could be that they weren't explicitly directed, but they just, stuck a microphone in front of the person who was, most jumping up and down. I don't know, but I wouldn't characterize that attitude as dominant among the fairly large group of students. I don't know the numbers, but there was something like, I don't know, probably 100 or 150 people in the audience that day. And that wasn't the majority sentiment among the people who were actually there, but among the people who local media chooses to interview, who knows? It's not exactly a fair sampling. So, but so who is the community, right? I mean, is this really the community, or was there a larger community that was being completely ignored and having a presidential finger stuck in its eye, basically? I think that's a legitimate question. And then ultimately, administrations have to just say no. They have to push back against, the loudest voices sometimes, if those voices are saying things which are incompatible with the true mission, the true purpose of an institution of higher learning.
Yeah. This could be an unintended consequence of what otherwise I think is a good sounding idea, that is of universities as having shared governance. The universities and faculty should somehow work together and be cooperative and all this sort of thing. Except, of course, the problem there is that faculty ultimately really don't have a lot of power in that relationship. It's the institutions that have all the power. They have the power of the purse. They have the power of employment and things like this. And so shared governance has been kind of a Trojan horse, I think, for bringing in this class of administrators that just seems totally clueless about what being a trustee and an administrator means in terms of being a public trust, and they're violating that public trust when they act like your president did. So has the situation at Saint Vincent College, do you keep up with it at all, or have you washed your hands of it?
Yeah, it's hard for me to keep up directly. I think I'm a little persona non grata there right now, but I still have friends there, people I know who are going on their merry way, but still, as far as I can tell, keeping their heads down, trying not to attract any unwanted attention from this administration, which is the way I expect things will limp on. I might have said, but I think the center that I used to direct, which was one of the oldest collegiate centers of its kind in the country, founded way back in the early 1990s, dedicated to freedom, Western civilization, the American experience. That might be able to limp along for a little longer, but a couple of very major donors walked away in the face of this controversy, and I doubt that they're going to come back. And so I think that little, academic gem, that outlet for heterodox opinion will be no more. At least it won't be anything like its former self, and that's a real loss for American higher education. There aren't that many places like that on American campuses, and Saint Vincent was one of the best of them. So it was a very sad thing. I expressed some sadness about my decision to resign, and that was genuine, right? When you've spent all those years building something like that, to see it destroyed and know that it's not going to be easily replicated on other sort of mainstream campuses is it's a sad moment, but at some point you have to move on when, as I say, you realize an institution can't be saved from itself.
One of the before we go to the Q&A, we have a nice list of questions and answers to get through. You've pushed a lot of buttons, Brad. Thank you for doing that. But of course, one of the ideals that should be prevalent in universities is that we should be able to look at the evidence and make up our minds, and it's for ourselves. And one of the pieces of evidence, if you will, in the whole controversy that led to your resignation is an actual video of David Azarad's talk. I would have liked to have seen that. And when I was searching for it, every link that I found to that talk came up, this video is private, or it's unavailable, or things like this. And so I'd just like to put out the call to our audience. If you find a link to David Azarad's talk at this conference, please send it along to us. But Brad, you were mentioning before we got started that you may have some leads on that as well.
Yes, I might, but I don't. I'm going to have to ask around. The video had been posted early on. Initially, the administration explicitly forbid us from posting any of the videos from the conference. They wanted the entire conference to disappear.
Sounds like China.
That didn't last long. Even they, I think, recognized the implausibility of hiding this entire major. I think there were 10 speakers or something like that in total. It was a large academic event with a number of high-profile speakers of saying that we will just airbrush this out of existence. So they were after there was some resistance to that. I quickly, within a few days, got permission to post the forbidden videos, as I started calling them, and I was hoping to have a kind of forbidden videos conference where I would somehow be able to talk about them or display them. But eventually the college relented on that sort of ridiculous early position. And they were all posted on the YouTube channel, the college's YouTube channel, as they normally were. They were all there. I discovered myself just recently that apparently this video, I don't know if the other conference videos, seems to have been scrubbed, seems to have been airbrushed out of the Saint Vincent photos, as it were. So I don't know if they were just feeling too much heat from it or the reason, but it seems to have been removed from the official channel. And I don't have the answer to that. I just discovered this myself recently, but I will ask around and see if, and I in one of the early pieces I did published online, I in fact linked there was a hot link to it. So I don't know why the college, I assume the college has decided they don't want anyone to see this once again forbidden video.
Yeah. Well, again, I'll put out the request to our audience members. If you want to do us all a favor and do a good thing, if you can find a link to this video, please let us know, because I have a feeling we'll be able to find a way to post it somehow so that we can actually look at the evidence ourselves and make up our own minds, which is what we should be doing. Okay, so let's go to the Q&A. We have a number of them. We have nearly 22 Q&A. There are a couple of comments in the chat. One from it's obviously a shortened name, mentions that cowardice does run through all our institutions, as it does and has through a portion of all human history. As societal values decline, courage is scarcer. So I'm not sure what leads what, but
I've talked about that a bit. I mean, I'll just say again, I do think that there's a sense in which it's even shorter supply now than it has been historically, although I agree completely, as I said, it's always been in short supply. One can never routinely rely on it manifesting itself when one needs it. But, in the modern age, when we're, at least in Western countries, we're at much more limited risk than people used to be, its absence in a way is even more obvious, I think.
Yeah. The person who asked that question has come back and said that he thought the contributing factor to this is ignorance of history, which is largely untaught these days, but affects all ages. Ask some academics, you'll see how many do not include the knowledge of the Constitution, obviously, knowledge of the past, and so forth. The audience can see these things. And I would just, this raises something that actually is a problem in the sciences as well, which is if you try to explore, say, the philosophical roots of evolutionary biology, for example, you'll find a level of ignorance of what actually went on and the controversies behind it. You'll find the ignorance of that stunning. And so we don't really teach philosophy of science anymore. We certainly don't teach history of science. It's thought to be kind of a diversion from what we should be doing, which is sitting at our benches and learning all the scientific dogma. You came from a liberal arts institution.
Yes.
Has the teaching of history and philosophy declined there as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, history in particular has become, as a discipline, I think, has become a slave to fashion, or it's long been a slave to fashion. Actually, one of my books that you mentioned earlier is a critique, actually, of the academic discipline of history, from the middle part of the 20th century onward, how historians have chosen, well, advertently or inadvertently, they have misrepresented the history of intellectual progressivism, the nature and influence of progressive thinking on American institutions. Historians who purported to chronicle that throughout the 20th century actually missed the most important elements of it, deliberately or inadvertently. So I think the academic discipline of history has been, in a way, lost for a long time now, almost from the get-go. And now, in particular, and right now, it's in the thrall of all the latest, fads and woke fads and fashions. It's a well-known fact that, political history, military history, sort of institutional history, constitutional history, these kinds of things are out of fashion, being replaced by various sorts of very narrow social histories, as it were. So I think history as a discipline, though, I just happened to write a book on this recently, has been lost for some time, but also other disciplines in the humanities. One of the things that I tried to do when I was at Saint Vincent was establish, and had some success, establish a great books politics department where these kinds of things, right, the great books, the great ideas, models of human behavior were in the foreground of the teaching of the discipline of politics or political science, so that we could draw some contemporary students could draw some appropriate lessons from those historical and philosophical figures. But that's not common. That's really, really rare within the discipline of political science and within humanities and social sciences disciplines more generally. So yeah, there's a real there's a real void there, and it becomes, a chicken and egg thing. Could we encourage the moral virtues better if we cultivated the intellectual virtues better, and vice versa, right? But it's certainly a moral as well as intellectual collapse that we face in our educational institutions.
Yeah, you mentioned several times, and in your article in American Spectator as well, how colleges that come from the Catholic tradition, Jesuit or or Benedictine in the case of Saint Vincent, one of the things that you pointed out that you found most congenial at a place like Saint Vincent was the fact that it very strongly encourage the kind of intellectual exploration of deep questions that should be the heart of any university, and the Catholic, at least in the case of Saint Vincent, because it was a Catholic university, it seemed to embody these principles, and that's just a lead into several of the questions here in the Q&A. Related to that, I'm just going to kind of summarize them. So Bob Moranto asks, well, why is it that Catholic institutions have so many free speech issues? Because he says that they actually do badly on fire ratings. And this is followed by a question from Carol to ask, how does this compare with the controversies of Providence College with Father Stanley? Is censorship limited to specific academic departments? And then Bart Lane comes in and says, well, because from the present Pope on down, Catholic clergy have become woke at best and communists at worst. Okay, so there seems to be kind of a general perception that this tradition of intellectual inquiry is eroding in
yes,
maybe the Catholic institutions, but maybe in the Catholic Church as well.
Yeah, many of my friends, Catholic friends, certainly observe that. I mean, I'm reticent to comment on other institutions. It's very hard to have a sense of what's going on at another place unless you're there or in some way intimately familiar with it. But I can speak most authoritatively about St. Vincent, and I'll reiterate something you just mentioned. For my first decades there, the first 20 plus years I was there, I found it to be an extraordinarily congenial place. I mean, as I say, the faculty leaned left, but for the most part, people were left alone. If you wanted to build something, if you wanted to teach something, if you wanted to have, outside speakers on campus who didn't reflect, the conventional liberal sensibilities, you were free to do that, and I would say even encouraged to do that. So it was a very congenial place, and I think on the whole, the Benedictine order amongst Catholic orders, there's much to be said for it. It's very sensible and humane and learned. But all it takes, again, is a single president, and it could well be that the Benedictines at St. Vincent and elsewhere are now, more, probably is the case that they're more under the sway of, you might say, the overall drift of the church as an institution. That would not surprise me, but it hadn't been a particular problem at St. Vincent College until the last 2 years. Just this president came in just before COVID, and as I say, when the masks came off, that's when he could, I think, really reveal his true concerns, which were particularly oriented around racial justice, or his, I think, understanding of the need to inject various kinds of sort of racial awareness, let's say, into St. Vincent, which in his view had been lacking at this small liberal arts college in Western Pennsylvania. But he managed to do it so far, I think, in my judgment, in a very ham-fisted way. So,
yeah. I'm going to skip ahead of Bill Shropshire's comment and come back to it a little bit later, because relevant to that, George Seaver mentions, as is true of so many collapses of academic principles at universities, such as at Harvard, it was the board of directors that caused it through their intentional choice for president, and he opines they should be condemned. But you mentioned that there was this activist board of trustees, and of course the president ultimately does answer to the board of trustees, and so which which was the horse and which was the cart in the case of Saint Vincent?
Yes, that's a very good question. It's hard to tease that out. I don't know. I'm not certain because I don't know all of these people personally by any means. I know a handful of them, but I'm not certain the board as a whole was activist or it was just inert in the face of, as often the case in any sort of committee setting. It's the loudest voices, the people who, come in with the most energy to want to push their particular point of view, who get, the group will kind of go along with it. So I'm not sure how much a sense of activism permeates the whole board, as opposed to, the one trustee that I mentioned who happened to be at the conference. I'm fairly certain she was out to, destroy this center. It might well be the case that, the chairman of our board, as I said, the very well-known sports figure was on that side too, although I can't say that authoritatively. Obviously, board discussions are very closely guarded, but many people suspected that. Some people wrote that in print. Other people in print, put more blame on the president, right? The president has to report to the board of trustees, but the board of trustees, in some ways, unless it's attentive, unless it's really doing its job, can simply become a creature of the president, right? They will only know what the president, what the senior administration wants them to know. So there's enough blame to go around. I'm certain a lot of it falls on the shoulders of the president, but I'm equally certain that a lot of it falls on the shoulders of at least some of the trustees. But how many, I can't be certain.
Who are the trustees answerable to?
Well, this is a good this is a good question. I mean, the idea of corporate boards is precisely to make sure that the governing authorities of the corporation are answerable to someone, but then ultimately the buck has to stop somewhere. And one would think at a what purports to be a serious Catholic institution, they would be responsible to their well-formed consciences in a way and engage these kinds of central questions better, I think, than evidently the Saint Vincent board did.
Yeah,
and some public boards have other responsibilities too.
Yeah. Let's come back to Bill Shropshire's question. As we know, this has been in the news lately. At University of North Carolina, there's a School of Civic Life and Leadership being founded at UNC, and this is supposedly, I haven't delved into it in much depth, but this is supposed to be kind of a counter to the increasing atmosphere of conformity and suppression of academic freedom and whatnot on campuses. Do you have any thoughts on that or any knowledge of that development?
I don't have personal knowledge of it. I know that the foundation of centers, though, is a real going concern at a variety of institutions. It so happened that the Saint Vincent Center was one of the oldest, as I say. Its formation dates all the way back to 1991, and it grew out of a lecture series even going back to the 1980s. Nowadays, everyone is trying to form these centers, often dedicated to sort of civic, constitutional, philosophic topics that are not covered in the normal university curriculum. The danger, of course, and I thought the St. Vincent Center was pretty insulated from this, given the nature of the, given its age and its ability to raise independent money and the profile, frankly, it brought to the college. It had been fairly secure up until the most recent blow up. But the danger, of course, is that these institutions will only have as much rope as the president or the senior administration wants to give them, right? So I'm all in favor of them, that they exist. They're being founded to supplement obvious holes in the curriculum and the faculty structure and the departmental structure of our universities. But one has to be very careful, very prudential, and you do wonder, some of them, how independent they really are from the overall academic orthodoxy. In terms of the one at UNC, I don't have any particular insight. I wouldn't purport to comment on them. I think in general, these are good and important things. I don't know that they will be a panacea. We really need to think in terms of changes of leadership, boards of directors, faculty hiring, personnel as policy. Those things are where it's really at. And those are really, really tough nuts to crack. But I'm in favor of these centers as kind of, doing what they can and stopgap measures.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's one of the things that we're exploring here at NAS is how do you liberate faculties from this kind of oppressive atmosphere of the universities? And we're leaning towards something along the lines of what you're talking about with centers, but a little bit different. Now, the next question is from Dave Porter. I'm not sure. I know I can't answer it because it involves Wisconsin Supreme Court decisions, which I know nothing of, and perhaps you can enlighten it. But this is an opportunity to just mention to the audience that you can type in answers as well if you have any insight. And so, Dave's question is: how has the Wisconsin Supreme Court's finding in McAdams versus Marquette affected academic freedom in private institutions? Are there other more recent cases that support private institutions' obligations to honor the premises or promises implied or explicitly stated in their faculty manuals? Can you shed any light on that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know. I'm hard pressed to think of many cases along these lines. I'll point out a good summary of a decent summary of the law as applied to the Saint Vincent situation was contained within the formal accreditation complaint that FIRE filed with our accreditors sometime this past summer. But if you go on the FIRE website, you can find a summary in their formal accreditation complaint against Saint Vincent College of various kinds of First Amendment law, but also law in general about, the contractual obligations of colleges. Outside of the Wisconsin case, though, I'm hard pressed to think of other cases. But people at FIRE would be the ones to answer to ask that question too.
Yeah. Okay. And again, those of you in the audience who know something about this, you can type in your own answers and enlighten us all. Maya Novakovsky, she asks a very interesting question, I think, which may go to the roots of this cowardice that we've been talking about. And her question is, are there any parallels with the way faculty gave in to demands of activists, students, and others in the late 1960s, such as at Columbia University? Do you think there's a connection between that?
Yeah, this phenomenon, I would say, of college administrators caving to the demands of the loudest voices, whether they be students or other faculty members, is most associated really with the late 60s, early 70s, when it really rears its head at Columbia, the so-called guns at Cornell and so forth, and a number of institutions. There were bombings at the Claremont colleges in California, and the speed with which some administrations seem to give into that. In other words, the adults turned over the reins of power to a certain degree to the kids, right? To the youngsters. Then I think it's fair to say that universities just started moving so rapidly in the direction, the radicals became the presidents, right? They became the provost, they became the faculty members. The phenomenon seemed to go away for a while, or at least it wasn't as prominent as it was when it first manifested itself, right? From the moment college presidents stopped wearing, tweed jackets and wire-formed glasses and became hip, it seemed like it was easy to take over these institutions, and the left was having its way, throughout the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. I think the interesting thing that's happening right now is it's a bit like the 60s, but maybe on steroids, right? Colleges have moved so far to the, to capitulate to the demands that now I think the sort of progressive forces in a way might be eating themselves, right? They've moved so far, but far is never enough, because there's so much expectation now of giving in to the latest woke demands. This just encourages more demands. So it seems as if the whole movie is now, being speeded up, fast forwarded, basically, and more demands, more and more crazy demands, and institutions that previously were not susceptible to this, want to get on that bandwagon. One of the longer articles on the Saint Vincent thing was called Yokel Wokeism, a clever title. In other words, the yokels, the people at the small colleges out in the hinterlands, want to be woke like their big city cousins. So now they're even moving in that direction. So yeah, I think there is a connection between these phenomena. And in a way, for several decades, the university was effectively co-opted by these forces who had been the student radicals in the 60s. And that happened apace. But now, of course, there's a sense, I think, in which, with all that movement, you're never going to be able to tamp down this demand now unless you just ultimately say, no, we're going to be a serious institution again. There's always going to be the next demand and the next thing and the next thing. It's going to suck more institutions, into this vortex. So I think the problem now, from the point of view of the left, is universities just aren't moving fast enough. They moved pretty fast in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, but now we need to go fully woke on all fronts. And even the progressives who run these places are having hard time keeping up.
Okay. Jonathan Sender, I think is how his surname is pronounced. He has an interesting kind of I apologize to everyone. I'm just recovering from a cold. He asked a question: how do you think a talk about white privilege, that is a mirror image to the one on black privilege that you referred to, might be received at Hillsdale College? Perhaps there already has been. And then, of course, one of the advantages of the Q&A session is that people can reply. Greg Peter replies that I would expect a discussion at Hillsdale to be open and tolerant, giving voice to all intellectual viewpoints, to which Jonathan Sender replies, I would hope so. But this is, this opens up kind of a question that how do you find the atmosphere at Hillsdale versus, say, Saint Vincent at its best?
My time, I've been a visiting faculty member, visiting fellow at Hillsdale, just coming in occasionally to teach courses for several years before I joined the regular faculty. But I'm a member for one semester now, really going into my second semester, and I can say with all honesty, and I'm not the kind of guy who would make this up. I think it's just a fantastic teaching environment. I don't teach on the main campus. I teach graduate students on the DC campus. These are, for the most part, working professionals on the Hill or in think tanks, and I think that they, in a way, realize there are some deficiencies in their undergraduate education, and their Hillsdale can help remedy some of these deficiencies. So we give them a real course of sort of constitutional and literary and philosophic studies there in the course of their graduate program. It's an absolutely wonderful environment. The place is firing on all cylinders, and the faculty members are uniformly serious and interested in primary sources and all of the things that are near and dear to my heart. So I found it to be just a fantastic place. I also have many friends who teach on main campus, teach undergraduates, and I've taught a couple of undergraduate classes in my time too, many years ago, just on a part-time basis. And it's just a wonderful group of students and a wonderful administration. Whether a talk that was mentioned has been given on the Hillsdale campus, I don't know. I do know that I said in the context of the controversy at Saint Vincent, had a speaker come to talk on white privilege and simply assert its existence and its dominating power in American history, he would have undoubtedly been praised, for bravery, or she would have been praised for bravery, for, taking what is conventional and what is fashionable. But you're not allowed to do the opposite, right? You're not allowed to play with that title and suggest that we really need to get back to a standard of broad legal and cultural equality. That was the thing that the college found offensive. So
Yeah. I'm going to skip ahead to excuse me, again, I beg your pardon. Another comment from Greg Peter, who replied to Jonathan's sender. Greg Peter said he would expect a discussion to be open, and I don't need to repeat it. But he mentions that a similar case, Vivek Ramaswamy spoke at Hillsdale earlier this week after a faculty panel on ESG investing. Very interesting. Is there a chance that teachers' education will not succumb to this neoliberal progressive fascism, or are teachers' unions already too invested in the CRT neo-Marxist paradigm? There's a couple of questions in there, but I think Greg Peter is agreeing with you that it's you can have discussions of controversial topics, probably ones that don't sit very comfortably in the Hillsdale idea, like ESG investing. So that seems to affirm what you have just said, that academic freedom and intellectual freedom is alive and well at Hillsdale. Let's see here, and what else can we say? Do you have any thoughts? Well, Bob Moranto asked, why has no one moved to fire these presidents? I think we kind of covered that trustees aren't willing to, and of course that raises the question of what power and responsibility do trustees have. So I'm not sure if you have any additional comments on that, but what does it take to fire a president?
Well, the president serves at the pleasure of the board, right? So, all it takes is enough board members to realize that this person is, ultimately doing more harm than good, right? But do boards actually realize that? How much, and this is not just a problem on educational boards, I mean, corporate boards, how much attention is the board really paying? Are the board members getting their information solely? Are they listening solely to what the president wants them to hear or what senior administrators want them to hear? Some boards are better than others, in my experience, and I think this is generally true. Boards of trustees of higher educational institutions, they're interested in the fundraising and the prestige and the rankings. I don't think they're too invested in a president doing something to fundamentally change or upend the highest purposes of the institution, right? As long as that president is raising money or perceived to be raising money and new buildings are going up. Unfortunately, I think that's what boards are most care about. That's true of corporate boards too. And there are now increasingly some board members who also want to signal their wokeness in addition to those things. But it's not a pretty picture. I doubt that a lot of college presidents are going to face the axe anytime soon, given the nature of the boards who are not looking at these kinds of questions as they should be. And I think that my view is that was certainly the case in the Saint Vincent situation. I think if more board members had fought back more vigorously, and again, they might have been given a little courage, had a group of faculty members fought back more vigorously, right? There's a symbiotic relationship, or there's a way in which courage reinforces itself, I think. And when you don't see it in one place, you're probably not going to see it in another. But I do think that, louder, more organized faculty dissent on these questions could lead back board members in some cases to develop the kind of courage they need.
Yeah. I'm just going to jump to the chat window for a moment. Our friend Bill Fretza makes an interesting point. He says that people keep saying that the woke invasion apparently happened overnight, and I suppose I'm guilty of that as well. Although I think it's actually more, what I would say is it has become so thorough very quickly. But he goes on to say that this is not factually correct. Okay, point taken. The long march to the institutions, in quotes, has been going on for half a century. That's ago. The conquest of STEM is the last step in the process. After that, it's game over. aspect out there. And I want to combine that with something in the Q&A from Mark Griffin. He says, is there any way to map this institutional capture? Are private institutions more vulnerable? Does the red state, blue state picture determine things in any way? I teach at a private university in a red state, by the way. And certainly Bill Fretza is correct in saying that this has been going on for a long time. I think it's been facilitated in the case of STEM by an erroneous supposition on the parts of most scientists that they really, and you mentioned this, Brad, that they don't really have to pay attention to all the things that are going on around them because they're dealing in science, which is pure and removed from all these other kind of things. And it's led to a kind of head in the sand mentality among scientists. And then when they find it swirling around them, you get people like Lawrence Krauss, for example, being surprised that this has suddenly happened to them. But of course, we have famous examples from the 1970s, Science for the People, and so forth. So Bill Fretza is definitely on point there. But coming to the issue of mapping them, I'm just going to put in a plug for one of our associates here at the National Association of Scholars, Mason Goad, who's been doing yeoman's work on this. He's just completed a very interesting report on just how it is that wokeness is spread through MIT of all places. And just to summarize one interesting point in there, he makes a point that this all started off with very benign conversations, how is it that we can get, more people of color and more women in the sciences and engineering? And it was all very open and nice and constructive and all this. And then that was taken as sort of morphed into this kind of authoritarian a mindset at MIT, and he's seeing similar things at places like Georgia Tech and other places that are devoted to the sciences. And so this just underscores Bill Fretza's point, which is this has been going on for a long, long time, and we've had our head in the sands about what's been going on here around us. And I think that's part of the kind of cowardice that we're seeing among our colleagues.
It's definitely true, but as I said before, I do think the movie everything is in fast motion now. Things are really, really unfolding very, very quickly, and we're reaching a point, I think, of no return for a lot of institutions, and ultimately we're going to have to build new institutions from the ground up, I think.
Yeah, I think so, unfortunately. Well, we're nearing the end of our time here. I just want to wrap up with a couple of the comments. I apologize to people whose questions we could not get to, but this has been a fascinating discussion. But we have to let our guests go rest because he's been doing hard work for us today. So Carol comes back here and asks, the immature response of opposition to the talk, meaning David Azerod's talk, seems to be another example of a lack of virtue. And is this a symptom of social media? In other words, are they the ones who are, if not causing it, but at least being a facilitator in it? And did social media storms have any kind of involvement in the controversy that you were involved in at Saint Vincent?
I don't know how much social media played a role in my particular controversy. It's certainly the case that as many people who have been faculty members for a long time have noted, social media has, I don't know how responsible it is on its own, but it has contributed to the lack of, how should I put it, attention span, the difficulty that contemporary students have, I think, in engaging lengthy arguments, something longer than a tweet, right? The demand for something short and sweet, and then to move on to the next thing. Real education, of course, doesn't work that way, and it involves engaging ideas and books and works of literature that require extended periods of reading and concentration. And in the social media universe, that's not a skill set that most people come to college with, but it's it's obviously broader than that. It's linked to K through 12 education, so when somebody does make an extended argument that people almost have a lot of people have an inability even to comprehend it. They can't pay attention enough, right? If a title upsets them, that's enough to get them out to want to cancel or somehow make their voices known because a short snippet of something they object to, but they're not necessarily willing to listen to the whole argument. So social media contributes to that, but it's not the only cause, certainly. I mean, there's been a lot going on for a long time in higher education.
Oh, yeah. Well, as I say, we're getting to the end of our time here. I just want to end on two comments from the question and answer session. One is from Don Morgan, rather hopeful comment. He says, I am on an alumni outreach committee of Cornell University Free Speech Alliance. And there's a similar thing, of course, going on at MIT, and these free speech alliances are spreading to various colleges. And Don Morgan goes on to say, we have learned that a number of Cornell's board of trustees endorse our free speech movement and are urging us to proceed with our actions to counter the hostility to free speech on campus. So that's a hopeful development if it indeed pans out. And then Paul Lake says, well, why not fight back hard? ? Sue everyone from the president, board members, and down for suppression of your rights, and of course, creating an intolerably hostile workplace. EEOC helps. I bet Peter Wood et al. Would pile on with amicus briefs. I hear cowards and bullies hate lawsuits, from Paul Lake. So a hopeful sign and a call to arms. Any last thoughts, Brad?
Fight. When these things arise, fight. Do it intelligently, but dig in your heels and try to get people with you. The bullies who often dominate our institutions, they sense weakness. They sense when a single animal is isolated from the herd. They know this, and I think a critical mass of intelligent and determined people could have surprising effects, and we're not seeing much pushback like that, I think.
Okay, Brad, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. And let me just close with a mention of our next Restoring the Sciences webinar, again, a project of the National Association of Scholars. It will be in 1 week. We normally do these every 2 weeks, but some scheduling issues means that we will have the next one on the 3rd of February, 2023 at this time. Our guest will be Dr. John Gentry, who's a former CIA analyst, and he's an adjunct professor with the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And the topic will be the CIA DE, the CIA DEI and the politicization of the U.S. intelligence community. And we'll have a co-host that night, Mason Goad, who I've already mentioned with respect to the paper on penetration of woke ideology at MIT. So with that, I will bid everyone a good day. And again, thank you, Brad, for
thank you, and thanks to NAS, and thanks to our audience. I'm very grateful.
Okay, all right. So good night, everyone.